This is kind of a different concept for us here at our Wisconsin chapter NRHS, sort of a round robin with presenters from Wisconsin's leading railroad museums. We call this a night at the museum, and we're bringing the museums to you. So next up, our third participants tonight, we will turn the floor over to Jeffrey Lentz. Oh, and before I do that, though, I will just mention here that that you guys who are mentioning that I'm going to need a disco ball in my background here. Janet has a line on one. She's going to pick it up this weekend. So we're on that. So next time we meet, we'll see something about that going on. So feel free to use this comment section for any comments to the presenters, to any other participants or whatever. It's just another way of building community. But again, we will wrap up tonight's presentation with a presentation from the Mid-Continent Railway Museum, and that is Jeffrey Lentz and Bill Burmaster and Pete Dietz. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jeffrey, and go ahead, gentlemen. Welcome to the Wisconsin Chapter's June meeting.
Well, thank you for having us. See if I can get my screen up here. And this is our Mid-Continent Railway Museum presentation. So the three of us that he just introduced, I'm on the left there. I began as an employee in 2001, joined as a member in 2004. And then Bill is in the center there. He'll be kind of taking over the latter portion of the presentation. And then Pete is on the line, and he's kind of on hand to answer questions about our STEAM program. So a little bit about what we're going to cover. Our crew, the coronavirus impact on our museum, our overall history, train ride, and what we offer at the museum. And then we'll get into some of the current projects. So here's just a few faces that in the event you contact the museum and for any reason, these are some of the people that you might get directed to. So I won't go into too much detail on there, but these are some of the faces of Mid-Continent. So we have at Mid-Continent one full-time employee that's year-round, and that's actually me. There's one part-time employee that's with me year-round, and then 8 to 12 seasonal employees for our train crew on the weekdays as a paid staff, and then gift shop and ticket agents and that. But on the weekends, that's all volunteer train crew operations. So we have about 80 volunteers in all, and over the course of the year, they turn in about 10,000 volunteer hours. And of course, they do many different facets of the museum operations. So getting into how the pandemic has impacted us, we are currently closed. And as a precaution, we've also canceled all of our dining trains that were scheduled for 2020. Our dining cars don't have the windows that open, so it's recirculated air. It's more difficulty with can't really have masks on while you're eating and serving food and that as easily. So that has been canceled. But otherwise, the other trains, the coach and caboose trains that we operate, normally we'd be starting up this weekend doing daily operations, but for now we are closed through at least June 30th, and we're kind of taking a month-by-month assessment on reopening for our non-food dining train, or excuse me, non-food trains. And one thing that's a positive here is tomorrow will be our first volunteering session that will be offered since this whole thing began. So, but overall, the risk of closure or anything like that is low. We do have some funds in reserve to go for a while here, but as that continues on, it just means that we'll have to eventually turn to borrowing, and so that's where long-term it could have an impact on us in terms of having to delay projects that we might otherwise be doing, but there's no real immediate danger for the summer here or anything like that. So, and you may have heard of our troubles in the past, so we are well experienced in adversity at Mid-Continent. The two most dramatic events were flooding events. In 2008, we had a major flood that closed the museum for 8 months, and it had over $1 million in damages. And then We had a similar flood happen in 2018. It was about 1 foot lower than the previous, that 2008 flood. But using the lessons that we learned from 2008 on what was going to flood first and what had to happen, we were able to evacuate quite a bit of equipment. As you can see, not all of it, some of it was either locked in by non-mobile equipment, or like the locomotives there, they had their trucks actually were off the property for repairs, and so they were sitting up on shop trucks and non-mobile, so they actually did not encounter any damage, and those locomotives were able to operate, well, actually the other locomotives were able to operate soon after. The ones seen there, the black one, that's our number 1256. That's kind of our primary locomotive that we use for the rides. Got the wheels back from that, from being replaced a little while after the flooding, and went right back into service. So, but much less damage than the 2018 flood because of those preparations, lessons learned. We have, even though we've been closed, we've been able to make some progress while we've been closed with our volunteering at home program, largely thanks to the efforts of Bill Burmaster to coordinate a lot of this stuff. Here's just some of the kind of projects. You can see some of the seat castings that were made at the foundry and being ground down, the leftover pieces, the sanding and finishing and painting, restoring lamps, creating new display signs, and so on. So backing up a little bit, our history as an organization, we were established in 1959 as a Railway Historical Society of Milwaukee. Started by 4 members, wanted to operate a steam locomotive museum, moved to in 1962 to Hillsboro, Wisconsin, which is about 45 minutes to an hour west of our location now, and operated there for 1 year on the Hillsboro and Northeastern Short Line before purchasing our own line in 1963 in North Freedom. And if you're not familiar with North Freedom, there's a little black arrow pointing to it. You can see that line going from Madison to Reedsburg. That is the former Chicago Northwestern Main Line. It essentially got replaced by that green line further to the north through Adams, the Adams cutoff in 1911, I believe that was, making the line through Reedsburg a kind of a secondary line. It used to continue on beyond Reedsburg. Now that is part of the 400 State Trail and Elroy Sparta Trail. And then today it is operated by the Wisconsin Southern Railroad as their Reedsburg subdivision. Our tracks are separate. It's a little spur line that comes out of North Freedom heading to the south. So our spur line, when it was acquired in 1963, it was pretty much nothing more than some rails going through weeds. There you can see that first season operating, they brought in a temporary depot that was under construction, and our steam locomotive number 1385 was operating that very first season. And then there's a similar view, the same vantage point with today's infrastructure in place. So that's about 57 years of progress in that picture. So what is Mid-Continent? We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a non-stock corporation, so there's no owners. We're not government funded in any way. We occasionally will get grants, but we are kind of on our own, and we get our funding from primarily the train ride, ticket sales, and donations and grants, and to a lesser extent, our gift shop and membership dues. You may encounter 3 different names, all kind of referring to the same thing. So our official name is Mid-Continent Railway Historical Society, and it kind of represents our organization designed to share railroad history. We have the roughly 500 members in 38 states, and we put out a member magazine, a newsletter, and so on. Then there's the Mid-Continent Railway Museum. It's kind of the physical infrastructure we have, and our primary means of accomplishing the mission by inviting the public to browse the museum. And then you might encounter Mid-Continent Railway, which is our reporting marks with the Federal Railroad Administration. But again, that's all under the Mid-Continent Railway Historical Society single entity there. So for the train ride portion, it's a 3.5-mile line. To cover it, our speed limit is 15 miles per hour. So it's about 20 minutes down to the end of the line, about a 15-minute turnaround time, and then 20 minutes back, giving a 55-minute total train ride. The equipment you see in the photo there, that's kind of our primary operating fleet, or a portion of it anyway, and dating from 1906 to 1929 for the most part for those cars. And then of course the locomotives are a little newer for now anyway. And then the conductors will collect tickets and share history along the way. So here's a close-up view of our route. Along the right-hand side of the map, you can see that there's a Wisconsin Southern Reedsburg subdivision line there that branches off in the village of North Freedom, goes about a quarter mile to our museum grounds, and then that's where the ride leaves from, heading from right to left across that map to Quartzsite Lake, where we turn around for the return trip. So you can see two kind of grayed out tracks there that were removed back in 1908 and 1914 that served iron mines in the region. That trackage is no longer there, but you can see some remnants of the roadbed. And so what you'll see along the route, first of all, once you get out of the kind of Baraboo River Valley, you see the Baraboo Hills or Baraboo Bluffs. The train route goes on a valley between the North Range and the South Range of the Baraboo Bluffs, which is the same geologic feature as what makes up Devil's Lake State Park, if you've ever been there. So it's just kind of continuation of that same set of hills. And so the iron mines, I mentioned all the tracks were removed over 100 years ago. The mines themselves are long since gone. Only the foundations of some of the buildings still remain in place, but the conductors share a little bit about the history of the mining, and here's some scenes from about 110 years ago outside of North Freedom. And along with the mines, another small town developed out there called LaRue, and you can see in the foreground, that's our train tracks passing through town. After the iron mine shut down, the town pretty well disappeared, and the only building still standing from that era is the tavern that you see on the far left-hand side of the photo. So, and then the end of the line, a mile to the south of LaRue, we call it Quartzsite Lake. There you can see the lake in the foreground, our little train, and then the large Quartzsite rock quarry, and that was the end of the line where they loaded the rock into there up until the 1960s or 61 or so time period before they put it up for sale, and was purchased for the museum in 1963. So the quarry, it is still active. I still occasionally get rock out of there, but they haven't hauled anything out by rail since 1960-ish. So here's a little map of our property. So it's an indoor-outdoor museum. We have in all over 100 cars and locomotives on the property, about 40 of which have been kind of stored in a prominent display, either up by the depot in that depot display area, train shed area, or the two coach sheds that we have. So in addition to that, we have our 1894 Chicago Northwestern Depot that was moved from the neighboring town of Rock Springs, at the time then, or earlier in its life known as Abelman, Wisconsin. We also have a water tower, elevated crossing tower, crossing shanty, and so on. And then not shown on the map is our engine house and car shop buildings. So last year we had a little over 22,000 visitors to the museum. And there's just kind of a aerial picture overview of that display yard, and it's the depot building on the left, and then those two red buildings on the far side of the street. That's our coach shed, so kind of our primary indoor display areas. And the first one has been there since 1976. The second one, kind of hidden behind the tree there, that just opened last year. So that's also known as the Lawrence Dorsey building, or coach shed number 2. It was just opened in October of last year. It's 10,500 square feet of new space for us. So you can see in that lower left photo, there's 3 tracks going inside of it there, and that's enough room for a locomotive and tender with 9 cars, which the big thing for us was, of course, we have a lot of wooden passenger cars and wooden cars in general in our collection, and that allows us to have now 85% of our premier collection of wooden cars or steel cars with wood roofs inside the buildings now. So that's a huge bonus for us. A lot less painting to be done going forward. So then the kind of moving on to some of our current restoration projects that we have going on. The big one is Chicago Northwestern number 1385. That's our big steam locomotive program under restoration. It's an R1 class built in 1907. It's typical of the what was used in our area. We have photos of not the 1385, but other R1s operating on our little branch line. As I pointed out in that earlier photo, it was the first locomotive used by Mid-Continent Railway Museum in 1963, and it was used after that first year. It was sidelined for about 10 years for repairs, began being used again in the 70s, and then become more well known in the 80s as it started to pull a circus train for a few years to Milwaukee, and also did some Prosperity special trips for the Chicago Northwestern, and as well as a few other excursions going on into the 90s before finally being taken out of service in 1998 for repairs. So at that time we had the Help Steam Live campaign to try to raise funds for it, and it was successful in raising funds, but as the project kind of began and the locomotive began being disassembled, realized it was going to be much more extensive than had been originally thought, and that kind of put the kibosh on the program for a number of years. So there it sat up until 2011 in a partially disassembled state, and then in 2011 we received a $250,000 matching grant to kickstart the 1385's restoration back to operation, and so took a few months of planning, but by late 2011 into 2012, work was already starting to begin. The first step was the tender. That was kind of viewed as the easiest step to get started in and get the ball rolling with. So that last photo, you can see that's actually a tender that was used at the museum over the years, but it was not original to the locomotive. This picture in the upper left here, that is the original, or at least going back to 1925 or so. I think we have a confirmed information that tender was with it as far back as that, but that's what came with it when it arrived in the museum in 1963. And basically after that first year, that was encountering problems. By the 1970s, when they were getting it back operating again, this was deemed to be junk at that time. It was parked at the end of the line at that quarry, and kind of just sat there going through the elements for a few decades, and you can see it was not kind to it. There was a flood event, rapid flooding, that partially buried the tender for a number of years before finally being unburied again. So anyway, it left it in very rough shape, and it was deemed to be not really salvageable. So in order to get the locomotive back to its original configuration, we did build a new tender tank for it. So you can see some of the design drawings, manufacturing in progress, and then that tender tank being delivered to the museum in 2013. Next up was the frame. So in 2013, the old original boiler was removed from the frame, and the frame and wheels nav were shipped down to a location in Middleton, Wisconsin for repair. There you can see by 2014 it was pretty well fully disassembled, and every square inch was being gone over for anything that was worn was being built up, or if needed, replaced. And by 2015, things were starting to come back together again. You can see it already had some paint applied by then. Along with that, the drivers initially went down to spec machine in Middleton. Later, it was sent on in 2015 to Strasburg Railroad for machining and application of some new tires there. So that's what that photo is, expanding the tires so they can fit it onto the, sorry, Pete's gonna have to correct me on this later on, but the inner portion of the wheel there. But anyway, the wheels are now back at spec machine in Middleton underneath the locomotive again. The cab was in rough shape after decades of sitting outside, so you can see there it being loaded up for delivery to a location offsite to be worked on, and then the completed or near completed cab in 2016 getting loaded up to join it, the rest of the locomotive again in Middleton at Spec Machine. And then the biggest portion was the boiler. It was going back to the early 2000s. A lot of thought gone into whether to try to repair the original 1907 boiler or replace it, and eventually was settled on replacing it. My understanding is that it's going to cost significant amounts of money either way. And one way, you had a old boiler that was good for a while, or spend a similar amount of money and have a new boiler that could last another 100 years for the locomotive. So that's the route we went. It's all new welded boiler, so it's not riveted, but it is welded. And there you can see that was delivered in, I believe that was the last weekend of September of last year, rejoining the rest of the frame and running gear there at Spec Machine. So that's a relatively current view of what the locomotive's status is. And so there's just kind of a little overview graphic showing some of the timeline of progress on various components. And so then the next step here, we're gonna, well, like I said, Pete Dietz is in the meeting here, and that he's on the 1385 task force, so he can kind of answer questions at the end of the presentation. But for now, we're kind of move on to the next subject here, the restoration department. So I'll let Bill take over from here.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jeff. Again, my name is Bill Burmaster, and as a volunteer, I lead and coordinate the restoration efforts at Mid-Continent. And at Mid-Continent, it's home of one of the country's largest collection and most significant collection of wooden passenger and freight cars. And this is really as a result of when Mid-Continent started in the early 60s, and members were scouring the upper Midwest looking for vintage wooden passenger and freight cars. And as a result, we're extremely well positioned to have a fantastic collection of cars. Unfortunately, they're all in need. When they arrived, none of them looked the way they do in the photo below. As a restoration department, I hold myself responsible for doing historically accurate restorations of the pieces of equipment. And Jeff talked earlier about the museum having some 100 pieces of equipment. The 50 pieces I'm talking about are really the ones that we call as being core collection items, ones that have historical significance to the upper Midwest and for a specific era of more of the 1885 to 1915 era. For the work that we do, as Jeff alluded to earlier, funding is largely from donations and grants, but at the same time, we do utilize some of the funds from the operating income from the train ride and from the gift shop to support the restoration efforts as well. Next slide. As you might expect, the labor for doing the restoration work is predominantly provided by museum volunteers. We have a tremendous amount of capabilities and skills, but at the same time, we do have to rely on contractors to perform some work if we don't have the necessary skills or equipment to perform the work. In a given year, we can have probably some 40 different volunteers that participate and are part of our restoration efforts, of which probably 15 or 20 are extremely or very active volunteers, where we would see them for multiple work sessions. We hold and schedule work sessions throughout the year. They're typically 3-day work sessions. They can be a Friday through Sunday or a Saturday through Monday session. And So we do this in order so that people can make plans and we can make sure that we've got projects lined up for everybody that we're expecting to come. The majority of the work that we do in the restoration area is performed within our car shop, and that was not shown in that map that we looked at earlier, but it again, it's a 2-track building, unheated. It is 50 feet by 250 feet, so it can hold 8 passenger cars comfortably in there and still allow plenty of room to move and work on cars. The projects that we are working on are really driven by a 5-year plan that we maintain and utilize. We're extremely concerned about being able to finish any project that we start. So we really try to stay focused on the projects in our plan and progress them. Unfortunately, restoration of this wooden equipment is a big time sink. Can take anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 man hours to complete a project, and this, with volunteers working on this part time, a single car could take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, depending on the condition of the car. Next slide. Next up, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk to you about some of the projects in our 2020 plan. I'd say up front that in our plan, we probably will be touching anywhere between 12 or 15 pieces of equipment in a given year. In some cases, we may be doing minor maintenance, or we may be enhancing or putting some final steps on a piece of equipment. And then there's other pieces of equipment where we're doing from a kind of a grounds up restoration. And the 3 featured projects I'm going to talk to you briefly about today are some of the more larger or more significant restoration projects. The first one is East Jordan and Southern Combine number 2. This car was built in 1864 by the Osgood Bradley Company, and it's the 5th oldest passenger car in existence in the country. So extremely old and rare car. You can see the framing in the photo on the left. This is all new framing that had to be replaced. That's the side sill, and that's like one of the first pieces that would get installed in the car when you're constructing it. And so extremely challenging to change out something like that once the car is built. And so we had the unfortunate challenge of having to change out the side sill on both sides of this car, as well as most of the framing. The photo on the right shows a more current view of the car, where we've got the car siding back on the car. And this pretty much represents the current state. And work is ongoing on this car, primarily focused on the exterior right now. But at the same time, we are also starting the work on the interior of the car. And the view, you saw some seat castings being a COVID project. Those are some seat castings we had made for this car. They're appropriate seats for the car for the era, and those will go back into the car once we complete as we complete the interior of the restoration. Next up, to talk about our second featured project I'd like to highlight, and this is Goodman Lumber Company Shea number 9. This is actually the last and only remaining Shea locomotive that operated in the state of Wisconsin. We're fortunate to have acquired this from our collection a number of years ago. The locomotive operated as a backup service into the early 1950s. When we got it, it had been sitting outside and had deteriorated quite a bit, and all the wood was rotten on it. And so over the past few years, we've been performing a cosmetic restoration on this locomotive. It's included constructing a new cab per the Lima drawings, all new wood beams on the front and rear, wood decking underneath the tank and the running boards. And this past summer saw us recreating the pilot on the front of the locomotive. We've got some additional items that we hope to finish up this year that will include putting the sandboxes on the back of the tender, getting it lettered, and ultimately we probably into next year we'll be putting the jacketing on the locomotive and completely repainting the locomotive as well. So moving on, the third featured project talking about is a Duluth South Shore and Atlantic sleeping car, and the name of the car was the Duluth. This was a 10-section sleeping car that was built for the DSSNA in 1902. The photo on the slide shows the car the first time we saw it after when we were considering the car to be bringing it to Mid-Continent. This is on the shores of Lake Superior and Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it had been used, it left the railroad in 1935 and it was being used as a camp or a cabin on this site. And so we inspected the car, found it to be in very good condition. And as you'll see in the upcoming slides, you know, it's really a treasure that needed to be preserved and find its way into a museum. Next slide, Jeff. So with this Duluth project, our goal is to accurately restore the car as a sleeping car, and at the same time make it capable of being operated at the museum. And we would also want to be able to open it up for guided tours. The Duluth, as it turns out, is extremely significant, not only to Mid-Continent's collection, but really to railroad history across the country, as it's the oldest and most complete example of a sleeping car in the entire country. Interestingly enough, you know, people normally associate sleeping cars with Pullman, and there are no wooden Pullman sleeping cars in existence from this era. This car, while it wasn't built by Pullman, it was built by the Barney Smith Car Company in 1902. It was one of 5 cars, and each car that the DSSNA purchased in this order cost $15,000 each. This view at the bottom was, the black and white view was taken in 1911. Next slide, Jeff. Here's the Duluth arriving at Mid-Continent, being backed in on our property. In the foreground are the 6-wheel trucks that we acquired for the car. Our goal in moving the car was to be able to bring the car to the museum and immediately place it onto trucks. Fortunately, the body bolsters and center bearings were still underneath the car. As you can see, truss rods were in place under the car, so this allowed us to be able to directly place the car right onto trucks, and that saved any future expense of having to pick up the car at a later date and set it onto trucks. Next slide. And here's the 2 crane lift picking up the car and setting it on the trucks. Next. This is an interior view of the Duluth sleeping car in the main sleeping car section, looking in towards the stateroom in the as received condition. This is without any restoration activities other than hanging a string of lights inside the car. Matter of fact, you can see off to the right, there's still plywood or OSB over the windows in the car. So this is literally as arrived at Mid-Continent. Next slide. So again, the car was moved to Mid-Continent in 2016. We needed to raise money to transport the car, and we needed crane lifts on each end, and that took some $25,000 to do that. Since then, we've raised over $50,000 in funds to go towards the restoration work on the car. Getting it back onto trucks, when we did, that really accomplished getting the car back. It had been off the rails since 1935, so that was over 80 years. At the same time we acquired trucks for the Duluth, we also acquired draft gear for the car, and we have subsequently gotten the draft gear back on the car, and so we're actually able to move the car around and switch the car around on the property. And Similarly, we've got the air brake cylinder, reservoir, and air piping reinstalled in the car. Next, inside the car, while you did see that one nice interior view that showed 2 berths, well, unfortunately, the 8 other upper berths and lower berths were removed from the car. This photo shows one of the reproduced, or you can actually see even off to the left. These are the reproduced berths that we have had made. This is an example of a contract work, extremely complex work, curved veneer with marquetry in there. And so this is work that's presently in process. The berths and upper berths and lower seat ends have been completed, and the next step is they are going to get stained and varnished. So in terms of what's going on this year with the Duluth, ongoing restoration work in the sleeping compartment, and we're going to be working on the roof of the car, taking off the existing roofing. There's multiple layers of rolled roofing, and the car originally would have had a canvas roof. To proceed with the project and the scope and the plans that we have, additional fundraising is ongoing. And we also, on an ongoing basis, we are collecting, sourcing needed parts, which can include things like brass hardware, the oil lamps. The car had 9 oval stained glass windows in it, and extremely hard things to come by are appropriate upholstery and carpeting for the car. The 2 views shown at the bottom of that slide are some cast brass claw feet that go on the lower berth seats. And here again, we had to cast 8 of those, and that view on the right is one of the reproduced claw feet that goes on the lower seat ends. Now we can go to the next slide. So as alluded to earlier, volunteer work at Mid-Continent is resuming tomorrow. We're taking all proper and appropriate precautions, working a lot of one-man jobs, spreading our teams out amongst various buildings and projects across the site. We have, our 2020 plans have been scaled back. So some of our initial goals that we had set earlier in the year, we will not be able to accomplish those, but we are optimistic about making good progress this year and going forward. Certainly to all you on the line and the entire Wisconsin chapter, we welcome you to join us, and we're always looking for new volunteers and anybody has passion and interest in working on any of the projects that we have ongoing. When you are at Mid-Continent and there is somebody working in the car shop, we do open it up for informal tours. And then also once a year, we do our vintage rail car tours, where we open up our cars in the display area and we have guided tours through the cars. On those dates, we also have guided tours in our car shops. Can't leave without saying that, donations are always welcome, and I can tell you that every dollar counts. It makes a difference. And, we're extremely proud of what we do there, and would like all of you to come out and see it for yourselves. With that, I say thank you very much. And I think at this point, we would open this up for any questions for myself, Jeff Lentz, or Pete Dietz. Specifically, Pete would be able to answer anything on the 1385 program.
I'm going to jump in here. Terry Peterson, once again, whoever from the staff there, I got 3 questions. What is the status, I believe, of the 988 as far as operational purposes? It was one of the things I like about it is I actually rode behind that. It's still in Milwaukee colors over on the Green Bay and Western or Appanee and Western line. When that trackage is still there, they were doing some sort of excursion train. That would have probably been in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. So sort of kind of been watching that unit bounce around over the years.
I'll
Jeff,
comment
take
on
that?
that one.
All right,
Jeff.
I was gonna say you might want to take this. So.
Yeah, yeah. It like many other projects, it's only awaiting money.
Of course.
The power trucks are being rebuilt, reproduced somewhat. We were lucky enough to get a set of power trucks from Clint Jones that would match what's underneath the 988. Fortunately, they were not on the museum grounds for either of our floods, so they didn't get flooded. The rebuild is still in process, as well as awaiting for some money and awaiting for time for the shop that's doing the rebuilding. Once we get the power trucks back, we still will have to do some electrical work and work on the governors, because the Elko governors were quite unique, and that's where it's at. Like so many other projects, it's not necessarily the first in line, but it is being attended to when it can. So there you go.
Okay, and then the second question, thank you for the update on that. Appreciate it. On the second question, now that you got the brand new bridge in, well, I know you got that newer one done too, but I mean, I believe the one over the Baraboo River, I believe that one right by the depot there. Are you planning on part of your excursions now to run into North Freedom on that now that the bridge is done, or is that just your connection?
I can touch on that, I guess. So the bridge, actually in this photo that's up right now, the bridge is just on the other side of that train in the center of the picture.
Right.
So it's just beyond the end of the platform, and that was damaged in the 2008 flood and finally repaired here in 2019. I'm confusing with my two bridges now here, but we've redone two of them here just recently. But yeah, so that is passable now. We've since been able to receive a locomotive and a car from the interchange with the Wisconsin Southern, which is where that track leads. So the interchange is only about a quarter mile away. So in terms of offering rides in that direction, it's not really gonna offer too much more real estate to run on. So at this point, there's no set plans on making that like a daily addition to our trips that we operate. And of course, being connected with the Wisconsin Southern opens up the question about, well, what about excursions to Baraboo or beyond? And we've kind of been checking into that a little bit, talking with the Wisconsin Southern Railroad. Right now, there's two hurdles, I guess, before anything like that can happen. The interchange track, once our track gets kind of close to theirs, like I said, we were able to receive a locomotive and a car via that track, but that was offered through one-time exemptions. If we wanted to operate something regularly over that, we would need to do some repairs to those tracks, and that's looking to be about a $45,000 project to get that track fully serviceable. And then if we want to actually leave the property, then we're also, of course, dealing with the insurance matters of liability operating on the Wisconsin Southern line. And at this stage, basically Wisconsin Southern hasn't told us, no, it's not possible, but the pricing that or the level of insurance that they're asking for, if we did want to do something like that, is so high that it would either require some very substantial fundraising or sponsorships or something to make that happen, or maybe some middle ground option would be to do something like the Sioux Line 1003 does, where they don't haul passengers but just still have an excursion with Santa on board or something only. But anyway, even though we got that operating bridge, we still got another 45, 50 grand to worry about before we can even get onto the Wisconsin Southern track. So, but it is.
You had that much work you had to do on the actual connection track.
Yeah,
as far as running on WSR, maybe that would be a, when you bring 1385 back online, and then make where you might be able to make it worth your while to do something like that and go from
So,
there.
so it's definitely in our thoughts, but it's not something that's immediately on the timeline here. So,
And then I had one last question. Now, when you guys were having the flooding, were you able to pull stuff farther down the line to the south to get out of that, or was all that line pretty much somewhere, in most places, was that underwater too?
we were, I don't know, Phil might have more exact numbers of how much got evacuated, or am I putting you on the spot?
In 2018, roughly 50 pieces of equipment were taken from the museum grounds and taken out on the main line and up on high ground. So as soon as you leave the yard limits, it's even prior to leaving the yard limits, the ground, you're going up a grade there. And so the lowest part of our property is directly in front of the depot. Coach Shed 1 didn't see water up to the axles. So a fair amount of our property, if you get the equipment out of the depot area and in front of the engine house, the majority of the restored and active equipment, you're in good shape then. So all the diesels and steam locomotives and the operating fleet all went up on high ground in 2018.
Okay, I was wondering about that because I was watching some of it on the cameras, on the webcams, but it was all pointing back, off the buildings towards the depot and so on and so forth. And I didn't know how the line was south of there. If you could, you were able to get up high enough to get a lot of that equipment out of there and onto the main and out of harm's way. And then I guess I'm going to throw one other quick question on the quarry part of it at the end of the line. Is that actually your property, or do you own the quarry or no?
No, we just own
The
50
track
feet
now.
or so on either side of the track. So,
Well, I'll add this in. Yeah, we actually own a right of way into the quarry itself, which extends a couple hundred yards beyond what we call the end of our passing track right now. It's not something that we travel on, but our right of way does extend a little bit further in. But the quarry itself is privately owned.
Hey, congratulations, guys, on what you guys do. It's a great museum and a great operation and some great preservation. And tickled to see the new coach shed come along last year. Just want to ask what kind of expectation for progress on 1385 you hope to accomplish this year, and what sort of funding is yet to be raised to complete the locomotive.
Well, I'll say that what sort of funding is expected to be raised? Enough. Like any other restoration project, you don't know how much it's going to cost until you're finished. I mean, Bill, is that accurate?
Yeah, but I mean, you're closer to the 1385. I'm not. But
well, I just meant in general terms is that
right.
It's very difficult to put a price on something. How much are how many dollars are we away? That depends on how easily things go together. We had hoped to be possibly doing some steam tests by late this year, but with the change in availability of the shop that's doing the work and their workload changes, has shifted some of our expectations. Probably I realize this is the most frustrating answer I can give, but it's also the most accurate. A steam engine will not run until it is darn good and ready. Have seen others in our industry get badly burned by making a promise or even of a specific date or even a year, we've decided not to do that, not to give a specific time until we actually start doing some of the engine testing. Then we can say, yes, this is when we'll open it up to the public. So I'm afraid I'm dancing around a little bit, but because there isn't a definite answer that we can hand you at this point in time.
Anybody else with questions then for our friends at Mid-Continent? Or for our friends at East Troy, or for the National Railroad Museum? Now would be a good time to ask. Anyone? Jeff, if you could unshare your screen.
Sure.
Oh, Mike, I'll add one person asked about whether or not we're going to be using the bridge over the Baraboo River. One of the necessities driving getting that bridge repaired is that because we do a runaround at each end of our train ride, we have to disconnect the engine, go to a passing track and run around so we can have the engine on the front. At the depot end, there is enough room past the end of the switch before the bridge to get a diesel in there, but there's not enough room for a steam engine because you've got the extra length of the tender. So in order to do a proper ride with our steam engines and be able to run around the train, we've got to had to have the bridge in service.
Got it. Anything else for anybody else? Well, then I'll just mention here from a housekeeping perspective here. This is our last meeting for the season. We will resume again in September. At this point, we don't know whether it'll be a live in-person meeting or it'll be another Zoom meeting. Historically, our September meeting has always been members' favorite slide night. There is a question as to whether we will do that or have a more substantive program for you for September, but we will certainly put something together over the summer. And generally we meet on the first Friday of every month. In September, though, we're not going to meet the first Friday because nobody's going to want to meet the Friday before Labor Day. So we will meet the second Friday in September, which will be September 11th of all days. But one thing to keep in mind for later on. Anything else before we close up from anybody?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank the people from the museums for coming down and showing us a real good evening's worth of programs. Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
Big round of applause to all of our presenters tonight.
Good job, guys. Thank you very much.
We're glad to be here.
Thank you very much for inviting us for the evening.
Thank you.
It's excellent. Steve, Evan, any last parting words from you guys before we close this thing up?
Come ride our trains.
Good. Ride your trains. That's a
We've
good one.
even got dinner trains figured out. We're going to be giving people cocktails on a train ride and then having the depot set up with tables far enough away from each other and then doors open so we've got good air circulation. We just felt like we couldn't do the dinner trains on the dining cars because it's recirculated air in an enclosed space. We thought we had it figured out, but decided in the end it made more sense to do it in the depot. So come enjoy one of our dinners. They're really first class 4-course meals on the high end.
Okay,
Excellent.
is this at East Troy or is this up at Green Bay?
This is East Troy.
East Troy. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Evan. And Bob Lettenberger, anything you'd like to say from the National Railroad Museum?
Love to see folks come up and see us this summer. Check both our website and our Facebook page for any of the latest details, not only on special offerings, but programs that we might be doing. We're kind of in the process of retooling a lot of things to move into smaller groups. Unlike counterparts in Mid-Continent, East Troy, we've got bigger facility, bigger capacity, and it's kind of getting us rethinking things right at the moment a little bit. So we'll be doing a few smaller things down the road. But pleasure being with everybody this evening. And if there's anything that we can do for the chapter along the way, please let us know.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. Excellent. Round of applause for you. And then Jeff and Pete and Bill, anything you guys would like to say before we close her down here tonight?
I guess I don't have anything too particular other than kind of echo what he said about if you're interested in checking out our museum, definitely call or visit our website since we are closed for now. And hopefully that will change in the not too distant future here. But otherwise, if you, I don't know if Bill wants to add anything about beyond that. But otherwise, thank you very much for having us.
Bill, Pete, anything from you guys?
I'd just like to say once again, thank you very much for inviting us in and spending the time and putting up with us.
Excellent.